Cure began life in 1976 in the southern English town of Crawley. 4 school friends, Paul Thompson, Michael Dempsey, Lawrence Lowell Tolhurst and Robert Smith, decided to form a band, which they named Easy Cure.
The Cure came together, it's basically a school band, I mean, pre-punk, so it's interesting that they kind of got counted as kind of a post-punk band, but their actual roots lie before punk. I think it's basically obviously Robert Smith as a driving force right from the start with a couple of schoolmates, putting the band together, playing the youth club circuit, so it's like your classic British kind of school band, never really having a plan to get anywhere, but right from the start they had more of a quirky kind of idea to what they were doing. I think Robert Smith's just a really good songwriter and a really good, he's got a really good imagination.
By 1978, Paul Thompson had dropped out of the band and the remaining members changed their name to The Cure. A demo tape found its way to Polydor A&R man Chris Parry, who was impressed enough by what he heard to ask for a meeting with the band.
Chris Parry heard them and really liked them. And they got them a deal on Small Wonder, which is like one of the hundreds of indie labels around the time. It's one of the more successful ones. And they put the first single out on that, but then he realised there's a bigger potential, so he took them and formed his own label called Fiction, which he did as a subsidiary of Polydor, which is a bigger label, and put them on that, and that kind of support really helped The Cure as well. Because being an independent label, idealistically, was fantastic, but it's a really rubbish way of trying to get anywhere, because there's just no support at all.
The 70s was an interesting decade in terms of music. I mean, there were all kinds of things going on, like glam rock, and you had Tamla, you had prog rock, and certainly that sort of, the prog rock was lending itself to something suddenly going boom, something was going to explode, something was going to happen, and of course that was punk.
1977 was really the high point of punk rock. Everything was thrashing, everything was bondage trousers and big hair and safety pins and, you know, torn t-shirts and all that malarkey. And The Cure came along and they really were something different. They had an enormous charm. They were very English. Their music was very English, I always thought. And very home counties English, you know. It was very much about southern England. It was very unpretentious, but at the same time it was very much its own thing.
In the winter of 1978, The Cure began recording the basis of a debut album. Parry produced and was keen that the group's sound should be sufficiently different from that of the punk phenomenon. Smith and Parry developed a more stripped-down, enigmatic sound, and in December, the band were invited to record a selection of tracks for the John Peel sessions.
A whole generation of people were listening to Peel every night and reading the papers, looking for something different all the time, saying, what's next, what's next? That was the question all the time, what's going to happen next? There's a hit list of things to check out, you know. You hear someone say, go check this band out, The Cure, you know, or you'd listen to Peel and you'd have a session. That's the first time I heard them, and it's just like, wow, this sounds great, this is so different.
In early 1979, the band returned to the studio and began recording in earnest. Their debut album, Three Imaginary Boys, was released in May to largely good reviews in the British music press.
People just trying to change rock into something completely different, just being obstinate really, just being a pain in the arse, and The Cure seemed to fit in with that very quickly. Because the whole generation was looking for this and it was getting encouraged, people were taking risks. And when you hear the first Cure album, there's a lot of risks musically and sonically being taken on that record.
It seemed like a manufactured sort of punk new wave construct that you couldn't really take seriously. And I got to review their first album, and I hated the whole packaging. It seemed to be there was a concentration on trying to market mystery, and that really at that time got up my nose. And I happened to review it on the night that Margaret Thatcher got elected, and I was in a really bad mood, and I really took it out somewhat on the album.
The first album doesn't actually sound anything like later Cure, apart from like the Smith's voice, which is like the constant. They don't. Apart from Three Imaginary Boys, it doesn't even have that kind of doomy kind of sound to it. It's very kind of quirky. The mix is really weird as well. You get like a really quiet guitar, really loud drums, or just suddenly flipped the other way around. It's really interesting the way it's mixed. I was always wondering if there was like kind of almost a dub reggae kind of influence in there, the way things are mixed almost back to front.
And they did a record 1015, which again was very, very stripped down, was very much not the thrash of punk rock, which was very sort of linear, blocky sort of music, you know, the Clash or the Pistols or the Susie and the Banshees. Actually, not so much the Banshees, but Buzzcocks or something, which was very much a thick block of sound from the first bar to the last bar. The Cure music at that time was very spiky and angular and slightly uncomfortable, slightly disjointed, and I like that because it took you by surprise always.
There's a starkness to the sounds, and it's very experimental. But in that period, people were trying to redefine what rock music was and change it into something else. It wasn't like verse, chorus, middle bit, guitar solo and out. There was a bit like you have a long intro and then the end, or just whatever you normally do, let's do the opposite. So like guitar solo, we'll turn the guitar down really quiet. So you could hear that in the way these tracks are mixed. There was definitely some kind of thought of trying to make this. It's very art rock, and it's a very conscious effort to like redefine the premises of rock and roll, and even the artwork of the record as well. You know, with the tracks they're not even named on the record. They just have little pictures for each track, and the covers just doesn't even have the name of the band or the name of the album on the cover. It's just like a random kind of bits of furniture from a house. So it's very, very much the time that people like trying to like change what rock and roll was and what it sounded like and what it looked like and what it's perceived as.
I think there was something about that first album they didn't particularly enjoy themselves. I think there was something quite fake about the whole thing, and the little squiggles and sort of symbols for the song titles and all that seemed really annoying and didn't really seem to reflect what they were really interested in. I mean, I think it was interesting that they'd come, you know, out of the sort of strange Bowie world of both pop songs and soundscapes, and at that time you couldn't really tell. Everything seemed to be like a desperate need to be interesting, rather than just being as interesting as they actually were, which slowly developed from there. And then I became a huge fan.
The recording of Three Imaginary Boys had been characterised by frequent and often heated studio debate between Parry and Smith. Parry had been vocal with his ideas for the band, while Smith had been equally keen to assert his own vision of The Cure, a vision on which he was not prepared to compromise.
I think from the start it was very much Robert Smith's project. I think he wanted other people to contribute, but maybe they couldn't contribute enough. I think the original lineup were Lowell Tolhurst and Matthew Hartley. I think he wanted it to be everybody writing songs, but I think he's just very creative. He's a very creative person. It's hard if you're in a band with somebody. He's a very good songwriter. I mean, other people did contribute bits, and they did write the odd song. But Robert Smith's stuff is just so much better. It's like any of those bands at the time. Any band at any time, there's always one, maybe two dominant members in a group.
Robert was very much the man with his hand on the rudder. But Lowell and Michael Dempsey were also quite strongly opinionated, I imagined. And I thought there must be some fantastic bust-ups in the studio when these three are recording something.
Robert Smith must have been, as a child, must be very into like, almost like progressive rock, or there must have been some like kind of Roxy Music kind of influence as well, very art rock kind of thing going on. But I think when punk came along, it obviously galvanised them and energised the sound, although they were never ever a straight kind of punk rock band. But that created the audience for them to exist in. I mean, people who got into punk weren't just listening out for bands that sounded totally like punk. People looking for like people who are going to change rock and roll. This is the whole idea at the time that rock and roll was going to change. And there was contemporary bands to The Cure. There was like Joy Division, who I think were a massive influence.
I always think what was interesting about The Cure is that they'd really come out of something like David Bowie, and the idea that David Bowie had written a lot of very strange singer-songwriter type songs, like early on with Hunky Dory and Space Oddity. And then he'd experimented with this idea of glam pop songs with, you know, Ziggy Stardust and up to Diamond Dogs. And I think Diamond Dogs was quite a key thing, because then that bled into that area where he worked with Eno and Low and Heroes. And I think that all that really is the seed of The Cure.
They come out of a sort of gloom rock strand as well. I've always liked the Leonard Cohens of the world, or the you know, some of that more gloomy Joy Division stuff, which I suppose was around more or less at the same time, which was the post, after that first huge explosion of punk rock, you got this Echo and the Bunnymen thing, or Teardrop Explodes thing, or, you know, the Liverpool Mob, or Howard Devoto and the Magazine, and the Cure, and then later on you got bands like Bauhaus and going into the new romantic thing of the early 80s, I suppose.